This video is going to walk you through making a sourdough loaf. I wouldn't call this a recipe as much as a collection of methods and tips on how to do this. The thing I've learned in the 4 months I've been doing this is that there's a lot of variety. Depending on how much time you have, depending on what the temperature is, depending on sort of what you're looking for in your final product, you can make a lot of adjustments as you go, and hopefully I'll be able to show you some of those variations as we go through this video. I start off with a large bowl and your very active starter. I feed mine in the morning and start my loaves in the evening at about 6 or 7, so the sourdough starter's been going for about 8 or 9 hours. I never do pre-ferment. I always just go with my active starter that's been going for about, like I said, 8 or 9 hours. Then you want to add your water, about 750 grams for this recipe. There's about 150 grams of the active starter, and you can tell that it's active by the fact that it's starting to float at the top of this water. I like to dissolve my starter in the water before I add the flour just to make sure that there's no clumps later. First, I add my whole wheat flour. For this recipe, I do about 250 grams. This is my basic loaf that I bake once or twice a week. Once I add the whole wheat flour, I like to mix that one into the water and starter. Again, just because the extra mixing helps me avoid clumps at the end. Once the whole wheat flour is mixed in completely, you can add your bread flour. For this recipe, I add about 750 grams, and this recipe actually makes about 900 and 950 gram loaves at the end. You want to mix the bread flour in very well. I use a bread whisk that I bought for doing all this mixing, but you could easily use just a wooden spoon to do everything. This is going to be a little bit harder than mixing in the whole wheat flour, but go as long as you can with your wooden spoon or with your bread whisk, and then either with the wooden spoon or with a little paddle, just scrape the sides off really well and just clump all the dough together in the middle. The dough is going to be very shaggy at this point, but that's okay. This first step is called the autolyse, and you're going to let it rest for about 40 minutes. This actually helps develop the gluten, which gives the dough a lot of strength and helps it hold its shape. Because once the salt's added, that actually will stop the gluten formation a little bit. After about that 40-minute rest, you want to add your salt. For this recipe, I do about 20 grams. And then you actually want to add some reserved water. We added 750 grams before the autolyse, and now we're adding 50 grams more. And once you add that water and salt, you just want to really incorporate that well using your hands. Just start folding the dough over onto itself and, squeezing a little bit here and there. And after a minute or two, all that water and salt should be really well incorporated and worked into the dough pretty nicely. Once the dough comes together completely, you're going to cover it with just a kitchen towel and let that rest on your counter for about 30 minutes before you do your first stretch and fold. The interesting thing about this dough is that there actually is no kneading of the dough. During the bulk ferment, which is this period after you add the salt, you're actually gonna just do the stretch and fold about 4-5 times, and that's gonna develop all the gluten you need. So after about 30 minutes after you add the salt, you're gonna do your first set of stretch and folds. And what you do is you grab under the dough for about a third of it, and then you just gently shake your hands back and forth while you lift the dough and fold it over onto itself. And again, you go around once, which is about 4 or 5 folds, and then you cover it again and you let it rest for another 30 minutes. And again, you're going to do this about 4 or 5 times for the first 2 hours of your bulk ferment. And then the rest of your bulk ferment will just be on the counter. And depending on how hot it is outside, this could be anywhere from 4 hours in the summer total before you do your pre-shape, all the way to 6 hours in the winter when it's a lot colder inside. Here, we're not going to see the second stretch and fold. And again, you can already tell that the dough's starting to have a little bit more cohesiveness. It looks a little bit smoother. It's starting to grow a little bit. It's starting to expand. And it's just starting to look more like what you're going to want the final product to be. So you go again around one more time, 4 or 5 folds total, until it starts getting a little bit hard to fold because it's sticking together into a big clump. And then you just smooth it out, cover it with your kitchen towel, and let it go for about another 30 minutes. I believe was the fifth set of stretch and folds. Again, you can tell the dough has grown quite a bit and is really starting to come together a lot more. After doing this set of stretch and folds, you're going to let this rest on your counter for another few hours depending on the temperature. At the end, you want it to be about 70% bigger, up to doubled in size would be ideal if you have enough time. For this loaf, you're going to see that I was a little bit hurried, and so I'm not going to get as much of a rise during this bulk ferment as I wanted. But again, you're still going to have a really tasty loaf, except the crumb might just be a little bit tighter. Once the bulk ferment is done, you're going to start what's called the pre-shape. I do this on a little stone counter that I have, but you can do this on a wooden table or on a wooden counter. And so you want to tip it out gently. It's going to be pretty sticky if you went with my hydration level. And then this is where one tool that's really indispensable comes in, and that's just a bench scraper. You can get it for $8 to $10 on Amazon. So you want to cut your dough in half if you're doing a 2 dough recipe like I am, and you want to just very, very lightly sprinkle the top after you cut it. And then using as little flour as possible, you want to flip it over and you want to stretch out each of the 4 sides and fold them onto each other, just to start giving it some shape. And this is where one of the more complicated steps comes in. Once you do this, again, using as little flour as possible, you're going to flip this over and start using your dough blade to shape it into a little ball. And the way you do this is you make sure that you flour your dough blade, but don't flour the dough itself. You want that to actually stick a little bit to the counter as you just push it gently with the bench scraper. And what will happen is the surface tension of it sticking slightly to the counter will start stretching out the outside skin, and giving it some really, really nice structure. So as you can see in the video, it's starting to look a lot more like a loaf of bread than the dough that still hasn't been pre-shaped. So you're going to do this to both of your loaves, or if you're working with just one, then just the single one. And then once you're done, you're going to again cover them with your kitchen towel and let them sit on your counter for about 30 or 40 minutes. And this will do is it'll relax the dough, and it'll loosen up again. So it'll spread out a lot more from the ball that you did in your pre-shape, but then you do the same process and shape it a second time. And that's when it really, really starts holding its shape. While this final shaping happens, I want to talk a little bit about timing. This loaf, I start in the evening when I get home from work, and I do the auto lease and the bulk ferment for the next few hours. And, about 30 minutes before bed, I'll do the pre shape, and then right before bed, I'll do the final shape. Um, this can also be modified a little bit. If you get home a lot later, you can do just the first 2 hours of your bulk ferment while you're still awake, and then you actually can leave it out on your counter if it's cold enough, overnight for 7 hours. And at that point, you'll have a really nice rise. And in the morning, you can do your pre-shape while you're getting ready. And then before you go to work, you do your final shape. And then once you do your final shape, I like to do a cold ferment, which means that I um, place the dough in, either a basket or a bowl lined with a kitchen towel. I cover it with a plastic bag, leaving some air in the bag to give it room to expand. And then I leave it anywhere from 8 to, I've done about 24 hours in the fridge. The longer it stays in the fridge, the more sour the final bread will be. But the better thing about the fridge is that the really long window lets you work it around your schedule. And so, again, you can start this in the evening, you can start this in the morning. There's a lot of variation. And so here on the screen, you're going to see the final shape, and you're going to see me very gently pick up each loaf and place it into a bowl that's lined with a kitchen towel and some rice flour. I use little wicker baskets that have built-in liners, but you can just use a regular kitchen bowl and a kitchen towel. And again, ideally, after the final shaping, you almost won't have much of a seam on the bottom of the bread. And if there is a little bit of a seam, you can just sort of pinch it together to close it off. And again, here I'm going to place these in some plastic bags and seal off those bags so that they can rest in the fridge for their final rise. And again, that final rise can be anywhere from 8 hours to 24 hours. And then you take it out and you remove the bags. Here you can see that they stuck a little bit, and that's because I forgot to flour the top of the dough before I put it in the bag. So just make sure you don't forget to do that. And what you're gonna do is you're actually gonna preheat your oven with a Dutch oven in it for like 45 minutes at 500 degrees till the Dutch ovens are really, really hot. Then you're gonna remove them from the oven and leave the oven at 500 degrees, and you're gonna tip the dough over really gently into each of the Dutch ovens. Um, this is a really hard step. I've often messed it up. But even if it climbs up the sides or gets stuck a little bit, you're still gonna have good bread at the end. The last thing you're gonna do before putting it in the oven is use a really sharp blade, either an X-Acto knife or a really sharp knife, and just do some scoring on the top. I still haven't developed my scoring skills too much, but you just need a little bit something for the bread to be able to rise once it's in the oven. After scoring the bread, you're going to cover the Dutch ovens and put them back in the oven at 500 degrees for about 20 minutes. I know this is really hot, but it's really the only way to get the great crust on the bread that you're gonna want. And what the Dutch ovens do is they make it so you don't have to steam your oven because they create their own little steam pattern. After about 20 minutes, you take them out and you can see that the bread has a little bit of oven spring and it starts to spread out where you scored it with your knife. Once you start developing your skills, you can make some really intricate patterns, but mine are still fairly basic. But you can see that, there's going to be a really nice crumb inside the bread because you're getting some really nice oven spring. So again, after 20 minutes, you put it back in the oven. You lower the heat to about 425 and you bake it for about 20 to 30 more minutes until you get a really nice dark crust on it. Here you can see the bread coming out of the oven, and it's really dark, but that's kind of how I love it because that's when you get a really nice, crispy, crackly crust on the outside. Almost immediately after you remove it from the oven, you want to take it out of the Dutch oven and put it on a little wire rack to cool. One of the things I've noticed at the temperature that I bake it at, I get a really beautiful crust on the top and the sides, but once in a while the bottom is a little bit too dark. I'll be honest though, I'll take that dark bottom because of what the rest of the crust looks like. These are both pretty decent loaves. They got nice and tall. They got some oven spring. As I mentioned earlier, I was a little bit rushed on the bulk ferment for this one, so the crumb is not going to be quite as open as airy, but it'll still be nice. Now I'm going to let you listen to one of the most beautiful sounds of bread making. It is the crust cooling and crackling as it cools. So enjoy that for a few seconds, and then I'll show you what the loaf looks like when cut in half. Now we've reached the end. Thank you for joining me on this bread making journey. I hope you have some successful bread making. And the last thing I want to show you is just me cutting into one of these loaves. You want to let it cool for at least 30 minutes before you cut into it, ideally a few hours. But I often can't wait for a few hours. So here is the crumb. As you can tell, it's a little bit open. There's a couple big holes in it, but it is a little bit tighter. Again, if this had had another hour or two during its bulk ferment on the counter, then that crumb would be even nicer. But again, I made some delicious sandwiches with this, and I'm sure you're gonna make some delicious sandwiches with whatever bread you make too. Thanks, and have a great day.